The Winnipeg Free Press proudly presents, in partnership with CJNU 93.7 FM, Nigan and the Lone Ranger. Here are your hosts, Nigan Sinclair and Dan the Lone Ranger Lett.
Welcome, everybody. As I'm speaking to you now, we are about 30 hours or so after the results of the Manitoba election became more or less confirmed. And as most people know by now, there's been a change in government. Manitoba New Democrats, under the leadership of Wab Kinew, will now form government. Wab Kinew becomes the First Nations premier, first minister in the country. So, anytime that a government changes hands, it's a pretty seismic event. Even for those people who don't vote, they should know that these kind of things affect a lot of lives. And it's not just a change in policy or direction, but it really is, a moment of transformation. And it'll take some time for us to tell exactly where the transformation is taking us, but it is a transformation. And one of the things, like those of us who work covering politics know very intimately, is that the people involved in politics are in fact people. I know it's hard to sometimes remember that these faces that we see on television and the people being quoted in the newspaper, that they appear like characters in some weird, reality show. No, they're real people. They have families. And it's also, I can say from, not from first-hand experience, but from watching it, it is one of the toughest jobs in the whole world. Putting yourself on a ballot, getting elected, getting reelected, taking on more responsibility. It's really, really a big and difficult thing. And when that's taken away from you all at once, that is a huge and difficult moment in the life of any person that's directly affected. And particularly following an election where there were some pretty controversial narratives that came out. That's a really, really, really long way of welcoming Rochelle Squires to the podcast today. Many of the listeners of the podcast are going to know who Rochelle is. She is the former MLA for Riel, Progressive Conservative MLA. She is a former cabinet minister of multiple portfolios, most recently families. She is a former deputy premier. And I'm lucky enough to know that she's also spent a much longer time in and around politics as a political staffer, and then before that as a journalist. Today, she is dealing with the reality of being attaching former to MLA. And Rochelle, is that how are you dealing with the former part now?
Well, thank you so much for having me on your show. And I think I said it best on my Instagram handle that I've revised, and I call myself a recovering politician.
that is, and if you want, I can use recovering whenever
sure,
I refer to you. Yeah, that's great.
Remember that there's a multiple step process with recovery.
That's right. Yeah. From election night, I mean, I think it's safe to say that, this wasn't a shocking result. You knew you were in tough some ways out.
Yeah. Yeah. And let me just back up a little bit and start comment on something you had mentioned in your segue. And that was about, politicians are real people, and people who put their names on the ballot are incredibly courageous. And I just really want to say to all the people who put their name on the ballot, and particularly in my constituency of Riel, Mike Moyes and Leamber Kensley, for putting their names on the ballot, fighting good, fair campaigns, and throughout the province, we had a lot of people who stepped forward and put their name on the ballot. And that's so important because we are seeing instances where there is a decline in that. And that's something that's worth unpacking, not just now, but well into the future. What's causing what's causing the decline in the number of people that are willing to put their names on the ballot on a go-forward basis. And then I also just want to touch upon the fact that we all have families, and I'm eternally grateful for my family for sticking through all of this with me. And right till the very end, my husband never let go of my hand and has been by my side, with the exception of about 12 hours yesterday to take all those lawn signs out of the constituency of Riel and get them in my garage. I don't know what the next step is for those lawn signs, but he's on it, and we're going to get those recycled as soon as possible. But the payback for that service and that comfort that my husband has provided is that assurance that Rochelle Squires will not be on a ballot for a very, very long time, if ever. And we are very confident with this decision that we've made as a family that I am finished with politics, and I'm very honored. I had 7.5 years of service in a capacity that so few people have had the opportunity to serve, and this was my 4th election, and I'm happy to see that all in the rearview mirror.
Well, just to talk about that, I mean, we talked briefly before the podcast, and I know that you're very emphatic in the work that you've done in the political world for at least the time being, and I think that that no one would blame you. It's politics is a tough game, and it certainly is. It's not even really a game. We're talking about people's real lives here, and certainly I wonder what the next steps are for you. But would you have a chance to sort of feel that Equal Voice put out a report just today, and what they announced was that there was more female, gender diverse candidates, more people from BIPOC, from different ethnic minorities. I mean, you're the former Minister of the Status of Women for Culture and Heritage. I mean, you have to take a little bit of credit, I think, for the fact that Manitobans were certainly open to voting in women and gender diverse racial candidates. I mean, your track record, if you look back, I know it's real early, but you've got to take some credit in saying that Manitobans made a big statement in all the different political parties on the other night.
Absolutely. And I always said that when I left politics, if there were more women and gender diverse people in politics than when I entered, I would feel as though that was a success, and that I would be very pleased knowing that I played a small part in that, and really, really excited to see the diversity of candidates that have put their name forward. And I certainly think that we have a long way to go. And when I was elected in 2016, it was the landscape has shifted quite significantly since then. And you're absolutely right, again, that we've done some. We've taken a small step forward, and more of that needs to be gained. But I feel as though that that Manitobans will anticipate a movement forward in that regard.
Well, I can say one thing, and I told this to your face off camera. I'll do it on the record here, that as someone who's worked with you and someone who my father has spoken very highly of you, and those of us in the Indigenous world look to your work. And one thing that I've always been very impressed by is your commitment to including people from diverse opinions and ideas, and particularly from different experiences, gender diverse and females and those of us from the Indigenous community. I mean, your record speaks for itself, and I think that you have lots to be proud of. And I think that we don't often, I think, talk in that way. If you're from a different political party, you might say, oh, well, there's no victories here. Or I think there is a victory here for someone who's worked very long for 7.5 years to try to build up, particularly the role of women. And all of us, I think, are thinking about Manitoba in a different way, particularly in the past 48 or 30 hours, as Dan pointed out. So just a miigwech to you for that.
Thank you. That just means so much. And I'm eternally grateful for your kindness and your friendship.
So the 2023 campaign, I honestly believe that, if I want to do this correctly, I should leave journalism for a while. I should go do a PhD in political science, and I should study it deep, like all the dynamics of the campaign, because I think the technical term that we use in the journalism business is that this was the damnedest campaign I think that I've ever seen. And I think as well, it was a campaign, the Progressive Conservative campaign was a campaign that I had really trouble associating with people like you and other people that I know in the party and have known for a really long time. So, let's have your frank assessment, both of what the campaign became, but also if you can talk a little bit about how this campaign was revealed to you. Because you were very much on the front line. You were one of the faces that the party wanted out there selling major planks. But I don't think I'm wrong in suggesting that you, before the campaign started or at the beginning of the campaign, really had no idea of which direction this was going to go.
No. And listen, first and foremost, I want to say that I take responsibility. I was a candidate in that campaign, and I was a member of that government, a senior member of that government, and certainly take responsibility. I'm not here to shift blame or point fingers. That's not anything that I intend on doing. What I wanted to do was send a clear message to a lot of people who care deeply about not just the Progressive Conservative Party of Manitoba, but really the function it plays in democracy. You can't have an effective government without effective opposition. And right now they have to form a solid opposition. And they need to determine how they're going to do that and what it's going to look like and what its identity is going to be. So in speaking out about some of the pivots that I'd felt were misguided at best and atrocious at worst, I'm not trying to deflect blame from myself and say I'm blameless in this. I think everybody who was part of that Progressive Conservative campaign needs to do some soul searching and look themselves in the mirror and say what happened and what role did I play in it? And I certainly do that and take that on myself. So campaigns are just very, the 4 campaigns that I've participated in since 2011 to now, there has been a shift, which I think is parallel to a shift we're seeing in higher offices, which is a concentration of unelected power. And I think that, you've all heard the phrase, the boys in short pants, in whether you're referring to the PMO or the Premier's office, all throughout the country. There's that concentration of power. And the elected officials are, the cabinet table and the caucus table are not always the most powerful tables in any government. And they should be. That is where the decisions should be made, at those 2 tables with the elected officials. And I see a pivot away from that. And then that leads itself to, I think, a pivot where campaigns would be run a little bit more independent of the elected body because of that concentration of power amongst unelected people.
So if I can kind of fill in some of the blanks in this, because it's a narrative that I wrote about in the lead up to the election campaign, but very early on, like months and months and months before the writ was dropped, it became apparent that members of the campaign team were very much involved in advising the Premier and even possibly even shaping government policy well in advance. And there was a moment when the Chief of Staff and the Clerk of the Executive Council, Phil Hood and Don Leach, were very suddenly relieved of their duties. And, and you can tell me if I was off base with this, but the story that emerged from my sources in your party were that this was the influence of, at that time, Marnie Larkin and Michael Diamond, who had been advising the premier on the campaign, and that there was a growing concern in your party that they had the premier's ear and possibly diverting attention away from the normal channels to cabinet and caucus on government stuff. Is that way off base, or?
Again, that's in keeping with that concentration of power outside of the elected officials' tables.
Yeah. So the budget that your party delivered in March, even members of the NDP said that they interpreted it as Heather's Duff-Roblin budget. Restore government services, build things, very much government has a role to play in people's lives. The theme of the campaign seemed to be a long way away from that. Mm-hmm. Parental rights was certainly a huge diversion away in terms of the narrative. The weaponization, my word, not your word, of the decision not to search the landfill, which nobody had any idea would become a major campaign theme. When did you start to pick up a sense that the party was going to pivot? It's really its brand, its entire brand.
The last 2 weeks were incredibly challenging. There was no doubt about it that that the campaign was off the rails, if you will. And even before that, there were certainly signs of that pivot and concern about the road that we were going down. And I mean, I get the scenario that we were under. I mean, mm-hmm. we were a government that had gone through some incredibly challenging times. We'd had a really challenging past 4 years, mm-hmm. governing through probably one of the toughest times in contemporary Manitoba history with the pandemic. And we were definitely, struggling. And I think that the budget that we delivered last year, when I think about some of the contributions that my department had made to that budget and the takeaways that we got to deliver moving forward with, the $104 million more for people with disabilities and solidifying that sector, coming up with that homelessness strategy, moving the status of women mm-hmm. secretariat from just being, a status of women to Gender Equity Manitoba, and signing on to that National Action Plan for Ending Gender-Based Violence, which also made available pots of money for other initiatives, including funding Pride Manitoba and the Rainbow Resource Centre. And so those were things that we were doing as a government right up until I honestly can't remember with certainty, but I think probably my last government announcement was at the Rainbow Resource Centre in July, where we were funding the housing project and the cultural center that they're building on Broadway. And so that was where the government road ended. And then we went into a campaign that just was really challenged from the beginning.
There's a really notable announcement about a week or so before the writ drops, where the party, the Manitoba Progressive Conservative Party, comes out and they make an announcement when it's around rights for parents. And the 4 new rights were about curriculum, addressing bullying, to have any notice about presentations by people outside the school system, and then consent before an image of a child is made or stored, which in lots of different ways don't appear that controversial. Maybe the one around presentations might be a little bit notable, or maybe ruffle some feathers. But just using the term parental rights draws in a lot of stuff that's happening in other places, and most notably Saskatchewan most recently by Scott Moe using the notwithstanding clause to try to evoke and push through the idea of parental rights, which is absolutely directly in Saskatchewan and New Brunswick and other places around the issue of pronoun use and talking about the issue of LGBTQ young people who wish to self-identify. What was your place, or what was your reaction to this, particularly thinking your track record on supporting LGBTQ communities and the fact that maybe on one level, and we had conservative members of the party who came in and said, this is not about LGBTQ, we got to stop making it about this. But it clearly was. Yeah, I mean, anytime we talk about parental rights, you're drawing upon that issue that's happening elsewhere. What was your feeling around that?
Yeah, that's certainly something that is going to be unpacked for quite some time, and I do believe that the conversation needs to happen because there is a gap between some groups in society and around this issue, and there are parents who have said, I feel very disconnected from what happens in the school when my kid goes there. And, I'll just use an example from my own personal life. My 9-year-old grandson, he had experienced a bullying situation at school, and he wasn't, he didn't want to, he was embarrassed about it. He didn't want to talk about it at home. And it kind of came out a little bit later. And then his parents were wondering, how did they not know about this a little bit earlier? That is, an experience that I've heard many times from parents in my constituency, and that have come forward and voiced an opinion about this. And so I do believe there needs to be a conversation. If parents feel that strongly that they're not informed of instances like that, and then the image sharing piece also is something that probably needs to be looked at, because 30 years ago when the Parental Rights Act was developed and written, it was not, there was no such thing as digital image sharing. And so, and anytime there's a disenfranchised group, particularly when we're talking about kids, there needs to be a coming together moment of discussion, a real honest dialogue without ideology, and certainly not on a campaign trail. So that is where I think the conversation got lost, because you're not going to be having any kind of non-ideological conversation. It is going to go to those places. And I regret that that narrative went to that place.
So I think because it was the term parental rights, that was the first issue of concern, because that is a banner, particularly used in the United States, to describe a very aggressive and very sort of right of center attack on, the Don't Say Gay sort of movement. So I'm wondering, not to refute the idea that there may have been a couple of common sense things in there, but what distinguished this announcement was that it wouldn't be explained. Mm-hmm. So we know parental rights evokes a lot of ugly stuff. The premier seemed to be unable or unwilling to say any more, although she did acknowledge that, forcing school staff to identify children that wanted to be identified as a gender other than their birth gender, that was definitely part of the discussion. So is there any, even though there may have been some very common sense things in there, are you convinced though that this was a play to curry favor in some very extreme quarters of the electorate? Mm-hmm.
Certainly do think that there needed to be a lot more unpacking of the intent besides what was offered on the campaign trail. And certainly I think that if there was that desire to move forward into that area, that it needed to be explained. And then people could rightfully or make an opinion about it, make a comment about it, and say whether or not they're going to support it or not. And I don't think that information was even available to candidates, never mind the constituents who were asked to vote on it.
Were we wrong in interpreting that, though, as a deliberate decision to kind of, tempt the more extreme quarters of the electorate and but provide some plausible deniability for the moderates?
Possibly, I think that's a polite way of putting it, in the sense that there was, it was like a double-edged sword or a double entendre. Yeah. And there again, in government, you need to understand that for every action, there's a reaction. For every decision, there's consequences. And it was just that, I believe, was very unfortunate pivot, and a very unfortunate message to put out there. And I rightfully think that Manitobans will be talking about that for some time. And I certainly think that that conversation does need to be had for those who do feel disenfranchised, because there's nothing worse than fear to create this extreme environment where we don't want to live. And so I think that conversations definitely need to be had. And if people are feeling that they're not heard, or they're feeling disenfranchised, or there needs to be a forum for that. And but it certainly is not on the campaign trail.
No, for sure.
The last 2 weeks of the provincial election in 2023, I think, are going to be talked about for years, for probably the main reason, which is this very stark moment in the party, in the Conservative Party, around the issue of the landfill. And it's something that has to be talked about. And it's hard to talk about it because we are talking about human beings here, and we are talking about the remains of human beings, and the family of Morgan Harris and Mercedes Myron, and of course Buffalo Woman that potentially could be at that site as well. It's hard to talk about these things, but we kind of have to when we talk about the final weeks of this campaign. And it certainly was something that defined, in a kind of ironic moment, a lot of things. And we ran a poll at the Free Press, and I'm sure, no doubt, you heard about it. And that the last week of September 25th, we found that in our poll numbers that 45% of Manitobans generally didn't support searching the landfill. 30% was a very hard no, and 15% were want to go in another direction, but sort of are unsupportive of it. And then, of course, 47% supported with that fairly hard, similar amount of 30%. So it was a very split issue in Manitoba. But the choice of the party, your party, was to go very hard against the landfill, and the famous phrase of stand firm against the landfill, and then frame this as an issue of making a hard decision. Were you aware that the Conservative Party was going to go in that direction? And then if so, was there a reason around the polling? Was it that an approach to really appeal to that hard 30? Or was it an appeal to try to get those moderates, which would have been 32% or so 15% unfavorable, 17% sort of favorable? Was it an attempt to try to appeal in some way? Is that what the attempt of that campaign was?
I can't say what the intent was, because I wasn't part of the decision-making process, or even in the room when the decisions were made for that campaign. And I wasn't aware of the poll. I only read it sort of after the fact. Mm-hmm. Keep in mind that I was in a very tight, hotly contested campaign, and was keeping myself very occupied with what was happening in Riel, and was popping up every now and then to do, other announcements on behalf of the campaign. And so when the ads appeared, I at first didn't really know what people were talking about. And then I sat down and read a few, looked on social media and found out that's how I learned about the billboards on Pembina. I think it was your column, Dan, talking about the billboards on Pembina that people would be driving by as they were going to a stadium.
The Bomber Games National Day of Reconciliation celebration. Yeah, and
so that was, leading up to that is when I was being made aware, and it was a deeply regrettable moment on the campaign that I really do think was a pivot. And I know that it took so many people by surprise, myself included, who were really just so ashamed of that ad campaign.
So I think in politics, we come to understand it that like people get involved in it, they're in it to win it, right? Like the great reward of a career in politics is a chance to govern and change things. I think the suggestion has been made that this was a desperate strategy, that it was sort of a Hail Mary or a last-ditch strategy. There were a lot, your government was carrying a lot of baggage from the Pallister years. In general, do you think the campaign was fair to candidates? I mean, all of you fighting, particularly in Winnipeg, was it fair? Did they, did the Central campaign seem concerned about the loss of seats in Winnipeg? Because we know that it landed with a thud. Like, help me understand here, was this a fair campaign for what you were trying to do?
I think campaigns are there is that centralization of power, that concentration of power. You don't have all 57 candidates weighing in on a platform or weighing in on a strategy or a campaign. And, campaigns are, until you've actually been through it, you may not understand it, but it's when party politics is very team orientated. You get involved in a party, you buy that membership, you decide to take that next step to put your name on the ballot, and you're kind of along for the ride, and you are there to be part of a team. And it's, politics and sports is one of those areas where when you join that team, you surrender your identity and some of your own free thoughts, and you
can't run a campaign on consensus. Yeah. Like, there have to be leaders in the
exactly. And so what I've seen over the course of time is that that has definitely taken less input from candidates, and more decisions are being made outside of the sort of larger room where the candidates are being exposed to the messages and the strategy, if you will. By way of comparison, I can say my experience in the 2016 campaign, well before we got on the campaign trail, we were given a preview of the commercials. And there was that one commercial that ran, it was about the PST increase. And we all saw that at a campaign meeting prior to getting to the writ drop. And that certainly was not an experience that we had in this campaign.
As parental rights manifested, and we talked again before coming, before starting to record, what I call the weaponization of the landfill site, but turning it from a difficult decision into I'm still looking for the right word to describe what it was the party was how they were trying to use that. But certainly the very difficult decision that the premier made, and then turning around and kind of using that as a positive attribute. As I understand it, because you spent a lot of time knocking on doors, through the campaign. Yeah. But two things happened. One was you really started to get a very visceral reaction from people in your constituency. And number two was that if that prompted you to make a decision about your participation in the Central campaign. Mm-hmm. So walk me through, how you got to a point where you had to make your own personal decision.
One of the things that I've done in the last 7.5 years is I've made numerous announcements regarding advancing women's equality and measures to reduce gender-based violence. And I think the hallmark for me personally was in the 19 election. I ended off the campaign making an announcement on Clare's Law, which now in our term in office, we were able to bring in that legislation, and it is actually going to be signed. It'll come into force upon proclamation in November, and I'm very, very excited that we will have a version, a new generation of Clare's Law in the province of Manitoba. And so in thinking about those issues, and because I'd carried a lot of water, if you will, on campaigns past, particularly on women's issues, it was a given that in this campaign that would be some of the, any announcement regarding domestic violence, I would lead. And so I was supposed to lead a campaign announcement in the final week before polls closed about more money for the women's shelters and domestic violence shelters. And I was not willing to do that. I pulled out and said I was not going to be doing that announcement. And I didn't attend any more party campaign style events after that, if you will, and just really had to make a decision of how do I stay in this campaign for another, week to 10 days, and do the right thing, knowing that I'm a candidate, I'm part of a team, I've signed up for this, I'm leading a group of people who have committed so much to this campaign. I had volunteers that had been with me for weeks on end by that point, who were out walking to the doors every day with me. How do I tell them that we're folding up shop 10 days before the election? How do I carry on? And I had to have some real soul-searching moments. Do I get up and go through the motions and see this campaign through to the end? And that's certainly what I did. And while the results on Tuesday night were nothing that anybody likes to live through or experience, there was an unburdening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think as well, your decision to kind of pull out of campaign events, which I'm sure, quite frankly, was not a positive development for the campaign. I mean, they did, in the first half of the campaign, they relied on you quite heavily. But you were getting, as I understand it, on the doorstep, you were getting real-time feedback on the campaign, and some pretty visceral reactions from the doorstep. People asking that they're trying to return their signs, whatever. Like, for people and you've represented them for 7 years, people in your riding, that must have been a really tough experience. Was that part of what went into your decision to just not be part of the central campaign and just focus on trying to make some sort of a connection with your constituents?
Oh, absolutely. And it was challenging to go to the doors, and I wasn't the only candidate in this election who would go to the doors and not have an answer. I'm not even going to try to come up with an answer and a justification, any reasoning. And what was worse were the people who didn't say anything, but you just knew that they were not even going to waste their time, waste their breath to tell myself and other candidates how despicable it was.
Because, and I do know, and I actually know a lot of elected officials that are this way. Like, they are deeply, deeply beholden to the people who vote and put them into elected office. It must be like a very disheartening feeling to think that your credibility, your cachet with your own constituents has been eroded. Do you think that relationship suffered more in the years leading up to the election, or do you think you were a candidate that they could support before the campaign made the pivot? In other words, did the campaign drive the last stake through your chances?
No, I think we were facing an uphill battle from the get-go. We certainly had a lot of challenges in the last 4 years, and even going back even longer, like the last, leading up to the 2019 election, we had an erosion of support. And my good friend and one of my political mentors, Calvin Gertson, says it best about, when the longer you're in government, it's like picking up stones and putting them in a backpack. You make a decision, and any decision that you make is going to have your opponents and your people that are pleased with that decision. And so you're losing political capital every day of your existence. You get elected, and on day one, you're losing your political capital until you've got no more capital left in the bag. And I would say that, personally, I'd felt that we'd lost quite a bit of political capital in the lead up to the campaign. I didn't go into the campaign with a position of strength or confidence, and so it's hard to pinpoint what was the turning point in going from having a successful run to facing defeat. It's really hard to say it was that particular moment, and this is when the erosion occurred. I think it was, successive errors and steps and missteps along the way that had led to that. Did people change their mind or stay home in the last 2 weeks that would have otherwise come out to support us? Quite possibly. And that's something I'll never know. Yeah. I deleted I never actually had the database on my phone just because I had other people that had that, but the voter ID. The voter ID, yeah, the voter ID. So we no longer have access, and I didn't do any kind of analysis at the end, so I don't know how much of my vote I actually pulled out of the ID'd supporters.
I just before Nigan comes in with a question, I do want to note that you pulled almost as many votes this election as you did in 2019. You were within striking distance of that number. And that your riding had almost the highest turnout in the province. And like just an extraordinary result for the NDP, like a result they had never seen. Even in the years that they won the seat, back in Gary Doer's years, they never got 6,200 votes. So there was something else going on other than Rochelle Squires in that result.
Yeah. And I certainly do think that my opponent, he had campaigned very hard, and he ran a very solid campaign. He was very dedicated to that campaign. There's no doubt about it. And I certainly wish Mike Moyes all the success in the world as he represents Riel.
We speculated that there was either polling data or certainly some moment, some decision, perhaps with the boys in short pants that you talked about earlier, that Heather Stephenson just abandoned Winnipeg and certainly didn't want to come on our podcast. It was the only leader not to come on our podcast, to not do major interviews with.
I think we can say now that was a huge mistake.
Right.
But sorry,
that's a big tipping point.
Yeah.
But it is highly ironic, and I can say with absolute certainty across Indigenous circles that I travel in, that she was going to First Nations. And hearing directly from young First Nations people, there was a really remarkable moment up north where she was going to First Nations communities, and they were literally holding stands and silent protests against her arrival. But yet she chose that over facing Winnipeg voters. And I think there's something going on there. There was some unknown story that perhaps we won't ever know about, but there's a decision there to, as you said, to there was kind of a failure in communication or an end to communication, that there was a decision made to just go to the rural areas or go to maybe the base 30% and end up in these First Nations, that you're not going to win, but then somehow to try to recover Winnipeg by appearing in a First Nation. I'm not sure what the strategy is there. We may never know the story. But you came out in the past 24 hours, you've come out to say that where or how or what does the progressive part of the title, what does that look like now? And I guess the question that I want to ask you here is, you've said that the party needs to decide, does it want to pivot right? These are your words now, and lose the progressiveness in the title? And if so, then be honest about it. Where does the party go from here? And what do you foresee in the term progressive in the Progressive Conservatives?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question, and certainly one that I think will be answered by people other than myself. And I've really, I wish everyone well as they grapple with that decision. And for me, my part of my bargaining with myself and my husband and my family was getting to October 3rd, whatever the outcome. That was the end of the line for me. And if I would accept what the voters had to say, and then we would be moving on. So I won't be a partisan in the trenches helping the party identify itself. So I think I can say with all honesty that there is a real opportunity for the party to decide what it wants to be. And there are voices in the party that are definitely for keeping the progressiveness in the party. And then there are a lot of voices that are not interested in having that part of the party. And those people need to get in the room and sort that out. And obviously, I would like to see the Progressive Conservative Party become even more progressive and really embrace some of the directions that the Progressive Conservative government had made in the last 7 years in regards to some of the positionings, some of the positions that we took, the policies that we created, the legislation that we drafted, and the initiatives that we funded. Having said that, if there's the other side of the party that isn't in favor of, for example, the renaming of the Status of Women's Secretariat to be Gender Equity Manitoba, if people aren't comfortable with that, and if the party decides that that's something that they are not in support of, then they need to be honest about that and be who they are, and so that we don't have the mixed messages that we saw in the last 3 months, because it's not fair to candidates, it's not fair to the voters, it's not fair to the stakeholders that we represent and that we befriend. I mean, in office, you become friends with stakeholders who begin to rely on you for your word, and they think, oh, we can go to this party, this governing party, and expect to be treated with with these principles as the just givens on the table, and then for those stakeholders to be upended at the end, if you will, is not fair to them either. And so if the party wants to have these conversations about whether or not they want to really own and embrace all that those parental rights encompass, have that conversation. Just be honest about it. If they want to pivot to the right, whether it be, there's a myriad of issues that need to be decided on in a policy room, whether or not we're going to continue supporting pro-choice values, whether we're going to continue funding pro-choice initiatives, whether we're going to continue funding abortion services and, in fact, increasing funding for abortion services, whether we're going to talk about the safe injection sites and its purpose in society, talking about the need to work with the most vulnerable and disenfranchised in a way that may not be palatable for others that have more opposing views. And those need to be thrown out on a convention floor and really talked about, and then be made public so that the public can actually decide and know who they're dealing with.
You say resolutions on the party platform floor, but I think some elements of the party might say that the leader gets to decide that, and it's not the party, that you can make recommendations to the leader, but that the leader ultimately gets to decide. I mean, certainly we saw that in the recent conservative federal meetings. But I want to ask one more question here, and it has to do with the progressive side. There's a reason that the People's Party of Canada believes that they could win a seat at some point in the future in Manitoba. Maxime Bernier ran in Portage-la-Prairie and really believes that there's a hard right element that is based on the kind of social conservatism that is based in some of those questions around progressivism that you're talking about. Was the Keystone Party something that the party wanted to? Was there really a fear around that there had to be some kind of turn towards that rather hard element, or an appeal to the hard element of the party, or the social conservative side of the party, that really needed to be dealt with, or needed to be taken care of and appealed to, and that might explain some of the hard social conservatism that took place in the campaign?
Well, I don't really know or understand how that thinking could really, penetrate deep into the party conscious, because as an urban MLA, as somebody who understands the constituents that I served, and so many of my other colleagues who represent, certain constituencies, it's not a hard discussion. It's quite an easy conversation. We know that our constituents, they like moderate, centrist ideas. They don't want they don't want the negative ads. They don't want some of these topics to be front and center. And so it's not really, it's not hard to look at the lay of the land and see what constituencies will swing based on those types of policies coming out, and the rural part of the province, which I've never represented in a constituency type relationship, but as a minister, I've traveled to much of Manitoba, and at the end of the day, we're not going to lose Emerson or southeast or southwest constituency if we don't, put up a campaign platform that will be palatable in Winnipeg. I don't believe that. I just do not believe that we have to pick one or the other. I think that to be a true big tent party, and that is, what I always strived to create and like to believe I was part of, was a party that could have room for that opposing views and differing opinions. And I hate to say this because I'm an eternal optimist, but maybe society has become so divisive, maybe the cracks have widened, that there is no such thing as a big tent party anymore. And I'm not saying that that is true. I want to be proven wrong. I do believe that Manitoba can have a big tent party. I believe that the Progressive Conservatives can be a big tent party, and have everybody in that tent feeling as though they belong in there. And I know that that is the party that I'd signed up for. That is the party that I was part of a government, and that was a party that was reflected for most of my time in that tent. And I certainly do hope that that tent only grows as I make my exit.
So, one of the enduring and possibly never to be answered questions about this, and it's connected to everything we've talked about. But it's Heather Stefanson's role in the campaign as leader, and I think we all accept that. The Heather Stefanson that delivered the spring budget, that negotiated herself back into a certain amount of acceptance with the LGBTQ community after that small mishap with the Pride Day. But, your government came back super strong with lots of bridges being built to that community, and they responded, and the same thing, I remember the Heather Stefanson that correctly, when no one else seemed to know that it was the obvious thing to do, negotiated the closure of the Prairie Green landfill, and appeared and met with the families and appeared. So that Heather Stefanson, and then the one that we eventually saw during the campaign. And so I guess that you did have an opportunity on the morning of the day that we're recording this. You had a chance to meet with the Premier and your cabinet colleagues, and you're still a cabinet minister kind of sort of legally, so I won't ask you to betray cabinet confidentiality, but in general, do you think that Heather was comfortable with the decisions that were made in the campaign? Did she see that these were at the time, this was the best strategy we could come up with? And, there's no doubt, she can't absolve herself of it. And I'm not trying to give her an opening to do that necessarily. But I think a lot of people want to know how she feels about it. And do you think that she feels, I don't know, comfortable with the person she had to be during the campaign?
Honestly, I never asked. But what I will remember from this moment forward, and now that I've got that the past campaign behind me and get to move forward as a free, independent thinking member of society who's entitled to her own opinions and all the privileges of being a unelected person, I will choose to remember a time when Heather Stefanson and I had met with the clan mothers, and we had them down to the legislature, and we sat in circle and we came up with funding for the Healing Village. And I will remember the time when Heather Stefanson and I met with families of, that had been experiencing gender-based violence, and we gave them money for healing opportunities. I will think about the Heather Stefanson that approved $104 million more for people living with disabilities. The funding for the 24/7 safe space for sexually exploited women and girls called Velma's House. That is the Heather Stefanson that I worked with, that I had the honor of serving with, and that is how I will remember her.
And I assume that you would have liked to campaign with that Heather as well.
I absolutely think that she has some wonderful parts of her legacy that happened in her short time in government, and I certainly hope for her and her family's sake, and that she will remember them and hold dear to them, because she did make a difference in those ways, and that was genuine. And so that is what I will say, and that's how I will choose to remember my time in serving with Heather in government.
There was such a stark difference, though, in the campaign, and then, even seconds after the campaign's over and Heather Stefanson's congratulating Wab Kinew in the victory. I mean, just what a stark difference in tone. And I think a lot of us, I'm reading a lot of comments from different people within particularly the Indigenous world, because I think the Indigenous world was really personally hurt by that campaign and felt very slighted that there would be such deep disrespect and that Indigenous women would be weaponized, or the remains of Indigenous women would be weaponized in such a way, again, are my word. And so, we've there was such a stark difference in tone, and it also comes across. I think Manitoba is going to be sort of reflecting for a long time about whether that. I mean, when we're playing games, and I'm using, that's my word, that when we're playing games, political games, we're really talking about real people's lives. And if you really sincerely believed in what you said on the campaign, it seems to almost cancel some of those things out, or certainly challenge some of those things, because it might be, people often remember campaigns more than policy announcements. And it may be, I think, one of the challenges. But, for you, now you've got a next chapter, a chapter here where you're heading off to do something else. I think all of us are curious as to what are you going to do? What's your plan? You said you were going to start writing.
Like we work for a news organization, so let's make some news.
Well, I regret to tell you that my future life will not be newsworthy in the least. So I have a new puppy. She needs to be trained, and she needs to be walked, and so that will be me. You can find me with a ball cap on and some running shoes, walking through Hentelef Forest with my dogs, with my kids, with my grandkids, and spending some much needed quality time with my husband, who thankfully, for one reason or another, decided to stick with me throughout this whole entire chapter. And something that a lot of people don't know is that, so Daniel and I met in 2007, and we got married in 2008. And in 2009 is when I began selling memberships. So politics has been the undertone of our marriage, for better, for worse. And now my commitment was to move forward and close the book, if you will, on those memberships, close the book on that partisanship world, and move into something much more calm, relaxing, and less newsworthy.
So I think we should respect the fact that you don't want to have a high profile and newsworthy life by wrapping up the interview. Maybe the last interview you ever do. That would be really great if we could tell people this was the last interview that you ever did.
Second appearance.
Yeah, the second appearance on the podcast. I do want to tell one, it's kind of a composite anecdote, but when the PCs were first returned to power in 2016, I remember bumping into you like 15 times in the evening at events. There was you and there was John Reyes. Mm-hmm. And you seemed to be at that time almost the only people in the government that responded to invitations for somebody from government, because it's a big demand, like come in, bring greetings, cut a ribbon, give an award or a certificate or something. And it always, it's one of those unseen things, except like 40 people at a time. And, I was so impressed, and I always have been impressed with politicians that, commit themselves 24/7. I mean, really, really, really public servant approach to politics. And, I really think that you embodied that you embodied the best of what it meant to be an elected public servant. And I'm not going to forget it. And, we'll have you on the podcast every once in a while just to remind people how good you were at that. But anyways, thank you so much for doing this. Difficult time in a difficult week. And you're very generous. And we're really glad you could come and talk to us.
Huge miigwech, thanks for your time. And like I said before, I think it takes guts to show up, and I think it takes guts to take some hard questions. And I think we threw some tough stuff at you today. So miigwech for your time.
Well, thank you so much for having me on the show. And it really was a privilege to serve this province for those 7.5 years. And I had an honor that so few people have had. I was the 60th woman to get elected, and it was a real eye-opening experience. And I certainly hope that my time in office, I moved the needle on a few things, and just a real honor. And I'm going to take all the happy memories with me and the lessons learned, move forward and have a less newsworthy life. But I will check in with you guys, and I am actually going to make good on that offer that you both extended to me, that the next time I get to be the host and you two are going to be the subjects.
We are, unlike some of the ads in your party's campaign, we are focus grouping Rochelle and the Lone Ranger as we speak. And if the results, come back positive,
I'm out of here.
Yeah, we'll have, listen, Nigan, what I can tell you is we'll have a full discussion among everybody who can actually be in the city at the time. How's that?
That sounds great. Sounds great to me.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, we had to come back to that.
Yeah. Thank you very much again, and best of luck with whatever you're doing.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, way to go. I wasn't going to bring up Rochelle and the Lone Ranger, but I thought that was awesome. Sorry, buddy. Who loved you?
I knew you were going to find some way.